Chapter 6 Dead Calm. For Adelaide Rickenbacker, the news came on Friday, October 23rd, in a phone call. It was General Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Forces. He was calling to say her husband was lost. 14 hours, SSW of Oahu. May have overshot island, hours fuel. That was the last the world had heard from Eddie. Adelaide spent that day and the next sitting by the phone in her New York City apartment, feeling useless. She called her sons, David and William, at boarding school to give them the news. Friends called and visited and sometimes let herself cry. For newspaper reporters, she tried to sound upbeat. Eddie will return, she said. He's too old a hand to get lost in any airplane now. On Saturday, the rest of America woke up to the headlines. In New York City, Rickenbacker, missing in Pacific on flight southwest of Hawaii. In Stockton, California, American ace of aces missing. In Doylestown, Pennsylvania, famed ace has again crossed path of fate. There was no mention anywhere of Bartek or Whitaker or the rest of the crew. The Army hadn't named them, or even said how many people were on the plane. For the time being, Rickenbacker was the man in the spotlight. He was Captain Eddie, or just plain Eddie, in many of the articles, as though he'd been an old friend to everyone. But Eddie was no ordinary friend. He was a daredevil of the skies, a living legend, the idol of millions, a great and far-seeing man in the best of our pioneer tradition. No one was ready to give up on him yet. Over morning coffee, people read about the rafts with their bright yellow coloring and their emergency supplies. Supposedly, down flyers had stayed alive for weeks at sea, though none of these survivors were named. And maybe it didn't matter, the papers speculated, because Eddie was in a class by himself. He had cheated death so many times before. Why should this time be any different? May his luck continue to hold, proclaimed the Mobile Register in Alabama. Those who loved Captain Eddie Rickenbacker and enjoyed his zest for living and fearless courage, the writer went on, will never be able to believe him dead, no matter how long he may be missing. Most of the articles, however, reminded everyone that another famous flyer had gone down 5 years earlier in the same part of the Pacific. This pilot had been attempting the last leg of a round-the-world flight when she lost contact with Howland Island, about 400 miles northwest of Canton. "We must be on you, but you cannot see, but gas is running low," was one of her final radio transmissions. Her name was Amelia Earhart, and she was never heard from again. Back at sea, the third day dawned in a dead calm. The ocean flattened into a gleaming mirror, broken only by the occasional shark fin. In a way, the change came as a relief. The 12-foot swells had turned the last 2 days into constant turmoil, salt spray flying and rafts banging into one another. The crazy ride made it impossible for the men to get their bearings on the world. Climb to the crest of a wave, and you command the entire ocean. Drop into a trough, and you couldn't see the next raft on the end of a 20-foot tether. Now water stretched on all sides of the horizon where it blended with the blue of the sky. Beautiful, restful, but it was getting them no closer to land. Cherry's t-shirt was a poor excuse for a sail in a stiff breeze. With no wind at all, it was useless. Rowing was exhausting and didn't seem to get them anywhere. At this rate, they wouldn't make it 5 miles a day. Fiji was nothing but a prayer. As the sun climbed and the mist evaporated, the men fought off the heat however they could. Rickenbacker passed around a few handkerchiefs that he had grabbed from his suitcase before the plane went down. The men tied them around their faces like bandits. No matter what they did, the sun roasted every inch of exposed skin. Whitaker and DeAngelis had dark complexions that kept them from burning too badly. But the rest of the crew began to look like lobsters, especially Reynolds, who had stripped to his shorts and thrown away his clothes. Rickenbacker actually thought he could smell flesh burning. As the day wore on, conversation dropped. The men slumped deep in the rafts. From time to time, someone baited a hook with an orange peel and let it dangle in the water. Everyone had stopped insisting they were about to be rescued. With nothing to do, boredom set in. Occasionally, someone would ask Whitaker what time it was. He would check his watch and announce the hour. 12:15, 1:35, 3:22. Rickenbacker would growl, "Well, there it is. Are you going somewhere?" At some point, Adamson remembered that he had stuck a Reader's Digest in his hip pocket before they ditched. He couldn't get in position to extract it himself, so Bartek did it for him. Saltwater had turned the engine magazine into a lump of sodden paper, but one article was still readable. The salvage page told the story of a balloon fight over France by the famous aviator Alberto Santos Dumont. Dumont apparently had packed a fine meal for his flight, and the writer was fascinated by it. There was chicken, lobster, ice cream, and champagne, each described in mouth-watering detail. Adamson tortured himself for a minute or two. Then he thrust the magazine at Rickenbacker, who tore off a small piece, baited a hook with it, and threw it to the fish. For the second day in a row, no one caught a thing. Mostly the men lay around in a stupor. Occasionally, someone would drift off, start to slide into the ocean, and jolt awake, grabbing frantically at a raft mate to stay in the boat. Then he would settle in again, tired from the effort. All day, limbs felt too heavy to move. Minds drifted lazy and vague. But little by little, one gnawing obsession crowded out all other thoughts. Every one of the men, Rickenbacker and Adamson, Bartek and Reynolds, Whitaker and Cherry, DeAngelis and Sergeant Alex, began to think compulsively about food. That was only natural. They had begun the long, slow process of starving to death.